we're here with the Right Honourable Jenny Shipley, who was Prime Minister of New Zealand from 1997 to 1999, but has had a long history in New Zealand politics, particularly in leadership positions, beginning in 1990 as the Minister of Women's Affairs. But I'm also seeing this Minister of Social Welfare. Did you hold two portfolios?
Of course.
It's not a bad start.
Doesn't every woman?
Of course.
Maybe so. So, with David and myself, the purpose of this interview is to explore your thoughts about leadership, your learnings along the way of this exciting journey, and you're still very young and got an exciting journey ahead of you, and we know that you're actively involved in business and in different issues, particularly with a focus on Asia and the Pacific, and also globalization. So we'd like to talk about the leadership challenges that you're attending to right now. But it'd be appropriate to begin with how you even got into politics, because you were a very young woman, it looked like, when you ran for office. And what was attractive about, for you at least, in getting into politics?
Look, I was brought up in a family where my father particularly expected my sisters and I to have a view. He cast a line, and whatever the issues of the day were, we were brought up both being expected to be well informed, but that wasn't enough. He then expected us to form our own view, and constantly challenged us that if we had a view, you then had to express it, and taught us early that in forming a view and expressing that view, you were contributing to finding the centre point of public opinion.
Right.
But you also learnt that, for example, you wouldn't please everybody.
Right.
And that public opinion is formed by counterbalancing set of ideas. So the ideas, the skill of expressing those, and the consequences of doing so were part of who I was as a child. I hit a period in time where New Zealand was having to change.
Right.
And I just figured that women and men should be there together.
Yeah.
And I felt that my generation had as much stake in a whole series of things like public debt and sustainability intergenerationally. And there were 4 or 5 others of us who were centre-right political people, but who believed that the agenda needed to be set.
Right.
And so we quite ruthlessly decided on pathways at different times over a period of 6 years of getting a group of people in there that could make a difference.
And what year was this group coming together and figuring out what you were going to do?
Well, interestingly enough, I wasn't part of the early wave, but in fact our party was in opposition.
Right.
And I was actually a mother of 2 young children, married to a 5th-generation New Zealand farmer, and should have been living happily ever after, thinking about nothing else other than, you know, the easy life. I was very good friends with one of the very active politicians, and a constituency next to mine became vacant. I was already involved in the party, rolling the bullets, and that's really where I thought I would spend my time. So the ideas of the time, the solutions that would fix the problems, how to set the agenda and create a momentum. I was already in that zone.
Right.
And I was in local government at that time.
Yeah.
Personally, I realised that someone else, if they were writing the law and holding the tax purse strings, that's where the centre of gravity in public policy lay. But just at that same time as well, this new opportunity came up. And to be fair, others said, listen, you have to have a go for that. I was really more of a mind that I had 100 reasons why I couldn't. And my husband and a number of other people who were also very concerned about the future of New Zealand said, come on, there's no reason why you can't.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a matter of self-doubt, it was a matter of choices I'd already made. So there was a big rebalancing that went on.
Right.
And the rest's history.
Now, the students who'd be listening to this would be wondering, you know, what kind of problems does New Zealand, or did New Zealand face, being this idyllic island in the South Pacific? But certainly in the 1980s and into the 1990s, there were some huge challenges that people in government took on, and I'm thinking of the massive privatisation efforts. Were you a part of that? Maybe just give us a sense. What kind of problems did the country face, and what led you to do something about it?
Well, you have to put New Zealand in context. We had fed the UK for 120 years.
Right.
They joined the EU and basically kicked us out of the cot.
Right.
And we had to grow up really, really quickly. And bless them, it was the kindest thing they ever did to us.
Yeah.
We have their history, but we now have our own future.
Right.
Part of that was realising that we had been spending the next generation's cash. When I came into government as a minister in 1990, we had had 17 years, consecutive years of deficit.
17 years
17,
of deficit.
1-7.
Wow.
And one of the things in the part of the 1980s was that we kept saying as a generation of young 30-year-olds,
Right.
this is cranky.
Yeah.
We have to make choices and we have to, you know, do the work, galvanise ourselves into action, carry the public with us and get on with it.
Right.
What happened was that we figured, and it wasn't just us, there was a mood in the business sector and some sympathy in the public, that if we were going to be a small, smart nation, making our own way, maintaining a first world status,
Right.
we really had to become much more fleet-footed.
Yeah.
And so an agenda for reform was really set.
Right.
And I'm very proud that having finished my political career, the percentage of government expenditure as a percentage of GDP had dropped from about 50% to the mid to low 30s.
Wow.
Public debt as a percentage of GDP had fallen down nearly in half from
Yeah.
when we began. And you never win elections on this, by the way,
Yeah.
but I'll retire in a rocking chair thinking, well, you know, I did a little bit.
It must. Yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
I wanted to go back, if we could, and retrace some of the steps that you've jumped over. Because so many people are curious how one goes from a childhood in which you have an active dialogue at home, as you just said you did with your father and your sisters. And by the way, were there any brothers? Or
Not a one, which is significant.
Yeah, I see. How many young women were there in this?
I was number 2. My elder sister would say I was in the slipstream. She took the flak and I had it easy.
Right, and how many others were after that?
2 after myself.
So there were four
Yes,
young
4
women.
girls.
4 girls. And is that a story in and of itself with a
Oh,
very active father and
and
these 4
mother.
young, and mother?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, I didn't really realise until perhaps my late teens or early 20s that, you know, the world was not an even place. My father had simply said, you must do what you have to do. Women certainly can do whatever they choose. And what's more, if you've got capability, you must contribute. My father was a minister of religion, very liberal, caught up in all of the doctrinal and sectorial debates of the 60s and 70s. And very much nurtured us in this environment of, these are choices. You have to think your way forward. People of principle and inspiration have to craft the future, and anyone with ability and commitment can do this.
Do you think then it's important as a woman and as a potential future leader to have someone who's there who really, either you're in a group of other women and so you don't know their gender differences, or that there is someone who is older saying, yes, you should have all the choices you want to make?
Look, the 2 people, my father and my husband, if I had to choose 2 people, even though they didn't know each other, were absolutely instrumental in, you must be who you are, because that's the person I adore, and actually I believe in both you and what you believe in. So it was 2 things. The capability of leading, and there was a natural ability to lead. I couldn't help but percolate into those roles during my teenage years and my early married years in both teaching and the non-governmental sectors that young mothers get themselves embroiled in. And, you know, it was a natural skill to want to help people move forward, you know, raise the money, do the things that you do in communities. But my father and my husband both recognised the qualities and the ability and continued to endorse me and create the space. When I was saying I couldn't, my husband said, there's no reason why you can't. I'll change because I want you to change. And I know that's rare, but choosing your husband well is a smart thing to do.
It's also good, wise to choose your parents well, right?
Well, I think that's also true. That's also true.
But now, you had these natural leadership capabilities when you were young, and so people could gravitate toward your leadership. Were there lessons you learned in those growing years about how you further developed and enhanced those leadership capacities that you think others ought to understand? We're trying to learn.
Sure.
We're trying to figure out, how do you help people develop?
Look, skills are acquirable.
Yeah.
You know, if you think you can't chair a meeting, work out how to, because the detail of how to is available. So offer yourself. You know, don't necessarily wait to be asked. Say, I'll have a go, because leadership is about recognising the skill set, acquiring the knowledge, and then practicing. And in my view, while it's demanding, all of those are acquirable and achievable steps. And if you wish to lead, you need to develop your strengths and recognise them, analyse your weaknesses and fill in the gaps. And I encourage many other women and men leaders to look at what they're good at and also be aware of what they're not effective at. And in doing so, then try and work out how to build on those spaces.
What kind of skill sets do you recommend people acquire?
Look, there are all sorts of things. Some of them are literally presentation. If you've got a squeaky voice, you need to lower it because you stop people listening. And so voice, enunciation, presence, projection, all of the practical things of communicating, because it doesn't matter how good your ideas are, you'll never be an outstanding leader if you don't have the ability to formulate ideas, and I'll come back to that, and then have a sense of mission, develop a strategy to achieve that mission, and then communicate.
Those presentation skills, did that come naturally to you, or did you
Partly.
actually work on it? And
Look, partly naturally, but when my father was a wretch, I didn't realise I was being moulded probably to the extent that I was, but why don't you go in the speech contest, even though all your friends had been going to elocution lessons and you hadn't. Right. He'd encourage you and say, well, it's your ideas that you should try, and guess what, you win the speech contest, because it's that blend of confidence, his belief, your determination, and getting on with it. So many things. What probably was that she talks too much as a child turned into she has leadership qualities in one's late teens, and then that moved into roles. But it was a pathway, some of which was by accident, some of which was both determined and perhaps intuitive development of skills.
Did you also find yourself taking responsibility at a fairly early age within organizations or within groups?
Very much so.
Taking responsibility for others, taking responsibility
Yes.
for the success of the group?
Even at school, from the time I was a young person, one found yourself as a prefect at school. In many of the areas in which I was involved, I was either chairman or president, and I didn't pursue those roles, but they tended simply to be there. Someone needed to take a lead. If I had the time and resources and the sense of commitment, I would contribute, and often, would do something, particularly when change was required. I mean, I'm a person that is not a passenger. I tend to want to see a sense of a need, a solution to the need, a willingness to execute that. Often when that's done, I'll say, look, I've had my turn. Now it's someone else's turn, and move on to whatever else it is that I'm going to do next.
Well, you got into politics with a reform agenda, and listening to you speak the other night, you described yourself as a reformer with very strong views. And certainly you've got your convictions, but you were taking on a distinct set of problems in New Zealand. And so there were habitual practices, ways of thinking, deeply embedded in the psyche and in the culture and the politics and the spending habits of New Zealanders. This was like an about face, it seems to me. How does one exercise leadership in a time of reform when you have a set of convictions, but not everyone shares those convictions, and you're really going to disrupt the status quo? What were the challenges associated in those almost 10 years in government as a minister and Prime Minister?
Well, look, the first thing we had to do was help people share the problem. So part of what we had to do is say small, simple statements like, you can't have people earning more on welfare than they're earning in work. It's not fair to have a family with a mum and dad and 3 kids on welfare next door to a family where they're working 40 hours a week and this family's taking home less than that. Everyone says, yep, that's right. And then you can say, so what we think might work is this solution. And yes, it's going to be hard because it means change here. But we'll invest in these people, albeit that will cut their overall payment. And if they try, we'll help them get into this group. But in fairness, you can't ask taxpayers to do what is unreasonable. So creating a sense of what the mission was, giving people a strategic pathway as to where the solution lies, acknowledging the hurt, because change does hurt people, particularly those you're asking to make change. And what's more, a lot of the taxpayer base really was worried, because they knew, and there was a lot of noise, believe me. But in the end, if you kept repeating, you can't have people earning more on welfare than in work, and putting the numbers up and showing them the facts, people in the end owned the problem that they saw us trying to solve. And while I did succeed in making myself extremely unpopular...
I would expect that would come with the territory.
Well, it was. And two things are worth noting here. You know, the party's popularity dropped, but the first point I'd make is you have to do what's right, even if it's not popular. And of course it's easier if what's right is also popular, but sometimes, as a leader, you have to accept that that's not going to be the case. But the second thing is, many people said, look, Jenny Shipley, you're nuts doing this stuff. You'll never lead the party or the nation if you go and take on these roles. It didn't occur to me that that was what I was in politics for. And what is more, I think history tells you that if you do what is right, and people have a sense that you are a person of conviction, and you do have an ability to give people a sense of purpose and mission, then over time they may well form a different view from the cheap, shallow headlines of what politics sometimes can be.
You said the other night that I'm about getting people to face reality. And I think that's a very critical element of the exercise of leadership, of getting people to face the reality of their predicament, their country, the role of government, their role, etc. But in facing reality, it generates significant opposition, and you said that you weren't particularly popular at different times. I would expect opposition would come from unions, from sectors of the public. How do you deal with opposition in a way that educates opposition and ultimately helps people deal with the losses they'll have to sustain to embrace new realities and take up new strategies?
Well, sometimes you have to provide information. I mean, you have to acknowledge, actually, where people are and say, look, I know this is where we are, but it's not sustainable.
So acknowledging where they're at, you're saying, is very essential.
Important, because it's respectful and it's not dismissive or arrogant. People need to feel that even though you're asking a lot of them, that they are not being completely overlooked. I'm sure some people, by the way, would say we did overlook them.
At times,
but we attempted to make people recognise who we were as a country, what range of choices we had or the lack of them, and the reason why we needed to have a sense of mission to get to a better place. And we kept talking about, look, our goal is far greater employment, but yes, some people will lose jobs in order for new jobs to emerge. And while people weren't sure, as time went on and the adjustment happened and more jobs did come, when the human capital and financial capital moved to the new areas of the economy, people who even had been sceptical helped us win the next election and then the next election. So from a period of very intense reform in 1990, 1991, 1992, when unemployment was 12%. And today in New Zealand, I just looked at the figures, unemployment is 4.4%. And that track has just been steadily down as the economy has been opened up, structurally reformed. The sector of government has been shrunk as a percentage of GDP as the GDP has grown, and it has as that transition has been made. And yes, it's been a demanding journey for some semi-skilled and unskilled workers, no question. But they are part of the success because they've been prepared to do.
So you're able to look back on what you've done and say, we actually succeeded here.
I think most New Zealanders, even grudgingly, might say that.
Yeah, I'm going to come. It's very interesting the way you've laid this out. In facing some tough choices, what I think I heard you say was basically you have to focus on here's where we want to go, but here's the hard realities we have to face now, and we have to make some choices about how we get there. And we need to work our way through those choices. We need to understand the realities. We need to work our way through the choices, and then find that path which will get us there, knowing that it's going to involve possibly some sacrifice on the part of some people. Is that basically?
There are
right?
two steps. I think within the, having committed yourself to governance, you are taking on the duty of dealing with the reality.
Right.
So as a government, you are looking at what choices you have. That's an early part of the process, some of which may be publicly related, some of which may not. So the concept of leadership is taking an intergenerational responsibility of what you need to face up to, what choices you have. And we had a headwind most of the 90s, not a tailwind, although we created a tailwind in the end. So there's that first step, and then once you've got your hands around what the problems are, what the range of choices, you need to start engaging. And while there may have been some third-party discussion, analysis, reporting, endorsement, there's sort of a convergence of what are the issues, what are the options for solving those issues, then bringing the public and creating that sense of mission, hopefully having a plan as to how you're then going to execute. And then the active leadership is having identified the need and the idea as to what will solve it, taking the actions to put that into place.
Right, but you said earlier that what you try to do is repeat again and again the realities and get people to own the problem.
That's right, very much so.
Which really, that was an interesting phrase, get them to own the problem. It just wasn't your problem, it's our problem.
I always thought it was success when whatever phrase I would use, and let's talk about welfare, that you can't have people earning more on welfare than on work. When I heard the commentators repeating that back at the headline of the news, I knew we'd succeeded because enough people had said it. Well, yeah, that's probably right. And, then, well, what do you think of? And then almost as a statement of fact. And there are processes in communicating a message, embedding it, and then owning it that is part of political understanding.
Right. On that, are there some issues that you think the government should basically say, well, here are our three options, and option 2 is the one that's the best for us, and let's now go take those 3 options to the country and persuade them of option 2? Are there some issues like that versus, well, there are 3 options and we aren't sure, why don't we take it to the country and let the country decide? There
are 2 types of leadership, there are 2 types of circumstance. In the early 90s, look, New Zealand's back was right on the wall. We had a reasonably narrow range of choices. And so some of the decision making was, in the first 100 days, we're going to set an agenda that will turn this country around from deficit to surplus, and you have to back us, and yes, it's going to be demanding. So there was a cluster of labour market reform, tax reform, welfare reform, and, we took people's breath away, and it wasn't that easy. But thankfully, in about 18 months to 2 years, you started to get to the sense of traction. In that subsequent 8 years, a whole series of things. We did more as you described. Here's an issue that needs resolving. Here's a paper that might scope the problem, and we might even invite others to give us a sense of what the options might be and start consensus building. And certainly since 1996 in New Zealand, where the MMP Parliament is now part of New Zealand's electoral structure, the issue of draft bills and the issue of consensus building within at least a framed area by the executive and the party in power, or the parties in power, has become a much more common tool.
But is in that, though, is the job of leadership to think through the alternatives and choose an alternative and persuade others of that alternative? Or is it to say, here are 3 alternatives, we're a little uncertain which one's best here, let's go to you and let's have the public work it through?
Some issues you can afford to do the latter. In some issues, when we were actually gearing the economy, where you were trying to get a framework of state sector reform, fiscal reform, monetary reform, to be frank, it is a macroeconomic and social environment question. And on the margins, you might wish to engage, but to create the framework that is New Zealand today, we really did have a big vision of what we needed in the toolbox. And some of them, to be frank, were not up for debate. We weren't going to have the unions tell us how to run monetary policy. We were going to decide that we'd find best practice worldwide and we'd stick it in the box, and that was how it was going to be. We introduced accrual accounting because we were completely and utterly committed to saying political parties shouldn't be able to stand on the stumps and promise things that can't be delivered. Look at 17 years of building up debt and posting the bill to the next generation. Right. Let's make all of the accounting systems transparent. Let's make new disciplines in the departments be best practice that the private sector would exercise. We're a small economy, we can do this. And boy, while it was demanding, you know, 10 years on, it's a matter of fact.
So it sounds like an awful lot of instances you sort of took, I mean, your government took a stand on, here's what we need to do, and then you went out and tried to get people behind you to support it so you'd have the support to get it done.
And certainly in the early years of the 90s, when I was a minister, doing firstly the welfare reform and then the health reform, both of which were major structural and policy reform issues, where we were shifting resources, we were changing incentives, we were altering what had been presumptions in terms of the social policy agenda, and there was a mix of economic and social outcomes we were seeking. Yes, we said, look, the sort of New Zealand we want is where people feel that they're stakeholders, not observers. And this is a journey we have to go on. You know, welfare to work, all sorts of themes, investing in education so you can earn more than, you know, a low-paid salary. You're going to get up into this zone. But it's a journey we're all going to share because this is the destination we're after.
So it's, you may have the view of how to get there, but you do want to get them to buy into it so they have a stake in the outcome and they have a stake in what you're doing.
But you have to have a sense of vision. If you can't describe both who you are today and what you think you're asking of them tomorrow, don't be surprised if people get confused and lost. But if you have a group of people who are the government, who can articulate a vision, a sort of this is the New Zealand we can be. It's like a destination. And there are some steps we're going to have to go along the way that, yes, it's change, and yes, there'll be things we'll ask of each of you. But we should see these as opportunities that we need to manage, rather than a crisis that will overwhelm us. And the choice of not doing it takes us here, and if we settle down, it'll take us here. And look, I don't want to mislead you. We had some folk in the streets burning effigies of me. And even the current government, you know, were fairly demanding in their criticism. But the greatest pleasure I have today is that 4 years on, since we lost office, some of the things I was criticised for have not been touched. And so in politics you have to decide if those outcomes are durable, whether or not that creates the framework that is who New Zealand is today. And I've got, you know, some small degrees of satisfaction in that area.
Jenny, let me just ask you more about that. Because on one hand, yeah, we can argue, as you certainly do, the importance of vision. But what if the vision is wrong? It's like, how do you know if the vision is right?
We were elected in 1990 with an overwhelming majority from the public, with we can be a more successful New Zealand. And yes, there will be reform. I was a welfare spokesperson, and I was saying we will have to reform our welfare state and see that people are rewarded for their effort. You know, risk and reward was a concept we talked about, empowering people and respecting their ability to make decisions for themselves, and our government would try and improve the conditions so they would then succeed in their own right rather than depending on us for their success. So it was a balance of philosophical and then pragmatic policy agendas that lay behind it. So it had a context as opposed to just roaring in and saying, have we got a surprise for you?
Right.
But look, please don't ever let students forget that leadership is not just managing the issues of the day. I often see people confuse management and leadership.
Right.
Management is a circular process of you've got resources, you've got people, and you manage their interests. And when there is no economic pressure or external pressure, you can get away with that.
Right.
But in every country, there are periods in history where you know that change is required because other forces are moving, and so you have to be fleet-footed and move ahead. No one can tell you the right answer. So you have to seek advice, you have to listen carefully, you have to study history, you have to observe international models, you have to seek other third-party views within your country. But leaders must, in the end, then take ownership of what will work and commit themselves to then carrying their people. Right. That is the nature of leadership. And while some leaders are good leaders but can't roll the bullets, outstanding leaders are capable of both understanding what the role of a leader is and carrying the ideas forward, but also the disciplines of and the responsibility of formulating the ideas based on the need that's been identified. And as I've looked at, you know, leaders I admire worldwide, they've had those dual capabilities, outstanding leadership skills and a sense of mission a sense of what they hope for their people, you know, real aspirations as to what they think they can lead their people to be and build a consensus around that. But they do also accept the responsibility and are pragmatic enough to say, look, of the range of choices, this is what we're going to do.
Right.
Because leadership in the end has got to be unequivocal at those decisive points.
What about the learning along the way? Certainly that's what you pick up from the population, the press and the opposition. But the personal learning, did you have people who were able to pull you aside and say, hey, Jenny, maybe your husband, try this, think of that, you may want to think about this differently?
Oh, of course.
Because I could imagine in those positions of responsibility, it's easy to lose sight of a lot of other things that are going on.
And leaders should never be left in isolation. Within our cabinet, we also spent a lot of time collectively as ministers and with a key set of senior advisors who were advising the government, saying, look, this is what we've said to the public about our nation and its future. We've said that we think there are these range of choices. You must now give us free and frank advice, not what we want to hear, what you think we need to hear. These are the areas that we want reform agendas in. And for example, in welfare, I had about 60 days and I sat everyone who had expertise down and I said, look, this is where we are. We've got to make some choices. You to go away and give me all of the options. The papers were written. They're discoverable under the Official Information Act in New Zealand. So there's nothing about keeping it close to one's chest. It's all discoverable, and I have to explain to the public how our government made those choices off that data. And it's a very important safety net because it forces you to think, now I'm going to have to explain this. But in the end, you also have to choose.
Yeah. To what degree were you schooled and how you thought about this by actually going out and looking and talking to the recipients of welfare and by the people themselves? How much time in those 60 days, for example, you're kind of welfare reform, how much time did you actually spend out in the field?
I had spent a lot of time prior to the election because I was the opposition spokesperson prior to coming in, and I had spoken both to people on welfare and employers and, you know, the whole context. Of course, some welfare beneficiaries were most disturbed by the fact that, you know, they were being asked to consider some choices. Others we met were women who felt trapped. For example, young solo mums who, for a range of reasons, didn't have economic choices and were saying, I don't want to only have $17,000 for the rest of my life. I want the chance, and I need help with childcare, and I need help with training so I can be at $33,000. So I designed what they called a JET program, where, yes, the welfare payment overall was reduced, but there were a series of increments that if you were investing in yourselves, I invested in you. You got childcare and you went to Teachers College to train to be a teacher or whatever it was.
So you the government provided some subsidies for the transition?
Well, they were ladders.
Or incentives, financial incentives.
Well, we talked about creating ladders for people to move forward in their lives, of which you'd use language like subsidies or training options or whatever. But again, the way in which we described it was important, because just saying, look, there's a subsidy available if, as opposed to you're important, and we're going to invest in you if you want to invest in yourself, and create ladders to the future. A whole lot of people said, that's what I want to do, even though they might not have thought about that. So having talked to them, some of them wanted a chance. Some of them, as I talked to them, I thought these folk need a chance. And if we get some really good pathways designed, but put some pressure on as well, more will move.
But you avoided the kind of language which said, you know, you're irresponsible to be poor.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You didn't put them into an other category.
No. Well, they might say that, but most certainly not. I mean, the whole goal was we want people to participate. And you have to understand in this backdrop, we went through a huge cultural revival, dealing with Maori issues where very serious disparity existed. So we've settled land grievances, we've allocated fishery, all with the rhetoric of we have to get people's eyes from the past to the future. And so folk feel like they've got a stake, they are stakeholders and shareholders in New Zealand Incorporated. This is who we are, and participation brings people together. Exclusion and sort of isolation leaves people apart. And unashamedly, our party believed that economics unites people. So if you get people to be economic participants, one way or another, whether it's redesigning your social policy or re-engineering your health structure or whatever, so the incentives are right and the rewards are clear, people in the end are much less belligerent and feel more satisfied.
What about leadership on the international stage? Just reading this article you wrote for us where you talk about East Timor, 1999, you're the chairperson of APEC, and you're at a meeting, I think, for around 6 days or so. Part of the agreement was that East Timor would not be put on the agenda. Could you tell us a little bit about what was going on behind the scenes there, your role, and the challenges of dealing with Indonesia to ensure that there was minimal, if any, violence in East Timor, which did not happen, but also the international communities, how they should and needed to respond to that crisis?
Well, East Timor was a catastrophe at the time of the APEC meeting. In the time running up to APEC, there are 2 or 3 things that are important. APEC is an economic discussion, and it's got China and Taiwan at the table. So if you put politics on the agenda, someone leaves. So the discipline around keeping an economic focus is very strong, and whoever is chair is responsible for trying to achieve that goal. But on the Monday morning prior to APEC, which was due to occur that following weekend, there was a terrible story of East Timor. A whole series of people had taken refuge in a church, and the church was burnt to the ground. And look, it just galvanised the leaders into action.
Because they all heard about it.
Well, of course, and we were all coming together, and quite properly the world press was asking us all, are you going to deal with this issue?
Right.
The foreign ministers had already arrived for the pre-APEC meetings, and my colleague Don McKinnon, along with a whole series of other people, Robin Cook from the United Kingdom was saying, you know, what are we going to do here? John Howard was engaged in this conversation. I can recall the Tuesday morning after this catastrophe, getting up and ringing my foreign affairs people at 6:30 and saying we have to do something about this, and others of course were at the same time saying we have to do something about this. I can recall talking to President Clinton on the phone, Kofi Annan, and that morning, and in the end we agreed that we would see if we could get the foreign ministers to agree to a meeting. Of course Indonesia was extremely vocal and didn't want that to occur, but extraordinarily in retrospect we were able to get the ASEAN economies and the Western economies to at least let their foreign ministers meet and see if there was some common ground. We recognised the issue of face for Indonesia. We also recognised that at that stage it was an unstable environment, so we couldn't expect the UN to go and peacekeep because there wasn't a peace to keep. It was actually outright war. And so in addition we had to try and persuade some of the leaders that if we were going to play in this square, how many of them would be happy to be part of a coalition of the willing in sending troops in to peacemake in order to get to the peacekeeping. And over a period of about, well, the time between that and the evening of the APEC summit on the Monday morning being convened, the most extraordinary set of conversations and events occurred, which concluded in my sitting up after a huge banquet prior to the APEC meeting and having been told that Habibie would come on CNN and say that he was inviting the UN in and also a coalition of the willing. And I was told it would happen at midnight, and it didn't, and I sat there and sat there and sat there, and about 1:20 I was starting to think, dear oh dear, this isn't going to work. But to my great relief, it did, and so we convened APEC on Monday morning with this extraordinary achievement. And it was a success that had many parents, many of the leaders at that meeting, but because they were present, and this is the point, where leaders are present in an international context and are seized with a moral imperative, these extraordinary decisions can be taken. And no one told us how that could happen. In fact, all our officials were telling us why it couldn't, because, you know, China and Taiwan might get upset and split the dummy. In fact, China and Taiwan and others participated in this delicate set of procedures, and we wanted Indonesia to feel that they owned the problem, and it would be misleading to say that immediately they understood that that was the discussion, but
Was it a hard discussion to
Well, I
participate in?
can remember a conversation that when I rang the president of Indonesia and told him that the foreign ministers that I had approved and agreed that foreign ministers would meet on the Thursday night. You know, it's one of the more remarkable telephone conversations I had during my prime ministership.
What did he say?
Well, that's a matter between he and myself, but if I'd held the phone out, you could have heard it.
But it was a tough conversation.
It was a tough conversation, and we had to disagree on some things. But it was important in that instance for him to be clear that a group of nations and their leaders had agreed that a process was going to be put in place where a discussion was going to occur. And his foreign minister was there representing Indonesia. And initially he wanted the discussion to be why it wouldn't happen.
Right.
And as it did happen, and he conveyed those messages, I think that the message became there is a region who wants to help. A choice of doing nothing's not a choice. This is a matter of leadership for Indonesia, and the moral imperative being felt and the shared desire to contribute to a solution is real, and while it may have been, you know, I guess judgmental in some respects, on balance I think it was an important indication of how international leadership can occur, and there are many other examples worldwide.
Right. Just one more point on this, because you were saying earlier about how President Bill Clinton contributed to, I guess, the empowerment or getting the regional leaders to take responsibility for what was going on there. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it was an interesting experience even for myself, because I had initially thought, you know, we're a minnow in this. We'll need the United States or one of the very big guys to lead. And the President said, look, the US is prepared to give logistical support and certainly be there saying this is the right thing to do. In other words, being part of the mission for a solution. But we can't share the burden of being the police officer worldwide. We are happy to do part, but we'd prefer to see some regional leadership. And that in itself was a good example of leadership, because in doing so, certainly Australia and New Zealand had put our hands up straight away, but Singapore offered troops, a whole series of countries that might not necessarily have stepped up to the line had the big guys said, look, we'll fix this. And so ownership again was a very good example of not only the President, but a number of people who said, look, leadership is about sharing this burden and sharing the responsibility of taking the calls and being part of the solution. And while some said they'd be part of the peacemaking and others said, no, we want the peacekeeping to be our focus, in the end we had an absolutely viable solution, and it was an interesting piece of history.
It was a big decision for you to send New Zealand troops to East Timor, I assume.
Look, freedom is worth fighting for, and fighting for freedom and fighting for peace is something that all leaders have to do. As a leader who is a woman, I don't see either the issue or the burden of decision-making in that regard any different to my male colleagues. I've been asked, actually, even in the States, could a woman president send people to war? The answer is, women and men, while their experience may be different, their passion for freedom and their sense of duty and responsibility is no different. While they may put different things in the mix and they may use their skills and experience in a different way, I do not for a minute think that women leaders are less able to do that. And in the case of New Zealand, where we've had a Labour and a National Prime Minister who is a woman, both the current Prime Minister, Helen Clark, and myself have both deployed troops in different circumstances, and I think we're quite capable of bearing that responsibility.
Yeah, very good.
There's so many avenues now that one would like to go down, and I want to return to the question of gender, but I'd also like to ask you were a person who exercised leadership within a domestic national context and then found yourself thrust into and had to exercise leadership on international context. Did you find there were parallels between the way one exercised leadership nationally versus internationally, or are there a lot of differences, or both?
Well, the answer is yes and no. Leadership anywhere, it requires an understanding of, understanding the issues, drawing together the range of options, consulting with your colleagues and trying to find a pathway forward. And whether it's justice or democracy or freedom or trade or whatever it is that the reason is that's driving you collectively, you then have to navigate the hazards. I think the cultural differences of economies is something that I've learned a lot about. And if you use East Timor as an example, the rhetoric was the ASEAN and East Asia and the Western economies will never agree. Now that's the old game. The skill became, how can you get this conversation to blend, where the issue is the issue, not where we've come from being the issue, or our polarised positions. And so, yes, I had to learn a lot, but dare I say it, I think the way women and men, when they work together, can say, but look, it's not a good enough excuse to say this will be difficult. Let's see if we can find our way through this. And
so
just
the
walking
experience to that, you've had the learning process you've gone through to become a leader domestically actually served you well.
Oh, of course.
But that gave you the foundations.
Yes.
To do
In this instance, because I was the first woman chair of APEC, I had visited 12 economies prior to that, actually to try and see that my colleagues who would be at that meeting would be comfortable, because I didn't want the issue of gender to get in the road.
So you went to 12 of the countries before you ever had.
I did state visits that were half a day, basically, because I knew that both the media and some of my colleagues, I mean, I respect the fact that many male leaders are not used to interacting with women leaders, and a number of the Asian economies, their leaders didn't even have senior women in their cabinets. And so I didn't want my gender to be something that became either a preoccupation of the media at the time of the conference to get in the road of the agenda. I wanted people to get over those issues. And so it seemed perfectly sensible to me to see that I had discussed the agenda, got the confidence of some of the key leaders of the economies. So by the time we got there, we actually sort of knew each other. So a conversation, just as a conversation in a cabinet is possible, that collegiality and respect and shared understanding of what leadership means was, I hope, at least partially established. And there were a number of other conversations. These were interesting times, and I don't want this to be put out of context, but in a meeting like that, there are many things running. From New Zealand's point of view, we had been, for example, lobbying to get Mike Moore as head of the WTO and Don McKinnon as head of the Commonwealth. Most people said I was nuts to be trying to run two international agendas in a 2-year period of my prime ministership. I'm pleased to report that we got both of them. And it wasn't just me. These guys put up a fantastic campaign. Other countries helped, but leadership is about having a sense of purpose and mission, getting a good strategy together and getting on with it.
Okay. So what's the difference between being a woman leader and being a male leader? Are there differences, or actually they're quite similar?
Well, leadership is the thread in common. But how you approach the leadership is a matter of style. And I think women no more think the same as men think the same. But I do believe that women and men together do make the most effective decisions. Because they do, we do come from a different space and experience. In my experience, women and some men will be very solutions focused. And I'm not sure if it's because a mother worries about, as children step up to the curb, what might happen if they get it wrong. So in other words, you anticipate a long way forward. People often say of women leaders who are effective, why are you effective? And if they actually probe, I think that there's some practiced and some intuitive capability of having a real sense of where are we, where do we need to get to, how do we manage the risk, where is the opportunity? Let's get on with it.
So interesting, because it's so often said about the way men and women talk that as soon as an issue comes up, the woman wants to know how you feel, the man wants to know what's the solution. And a woman that says, I don't want to know about the solution, let's talk about how I feel. But you actually think women are the more solution-oriented.
Well, I wouldn't say either or, but in my experience, able women leaders who understand that it's not just being there. Right? I've written quite extensively or spoken quite extensively that neither women nor men should ever misunderstand what leadership is about. Leadership is not about occupying a space. Leadership is an active process, not a matter of status and position. I am incensed by people who say it is their role. The cloak of prime ministership is a cloak one puts on, and either you take it off or it is taken from you. But misunderstanding that is a huge blunder, because you only hurt yourself and you probably muck up the opportunity as well.
Do you think the leader is someone who's at the top of a pyramid or someone who's at the center of an organization?
There should be leaders everywhere.
But I mean, do you lead from the center of an organization and reaching out and bringing people along? Or
I know, I lead from the front and pick people up.
Oh, you lead from the front. That's an interesting. That's a change. That's interesting. Okay, so you lead from the front and bring them with you.
Top is the wrong idea.
Okay.
If I've got an audience in front of me, I say, look, leadership is not the prerogative of only those who've percolated to the top or the front. If everyone leads, a lot gets done. And again, leadership is not something that I allow anyone to be lazy about. You know, people often say it's your job. It's not their job. They happen to be leading from the front, but their job is to corral others, or others to say, I'm going to support you. So leadership might be a person saying, I'll look after you kids, or I'll write you a paper, or, you know, I'm going to go and ring up some people and tell them to come to your meeting, or that's leadership from where they are, but all having a sense of mission of where you go. The leader is the person who, by their inspiration and clarity of thought and foresight, often has created that sense of purpose, which gather all these people up and commit them to wanting to lead collectively.
So you're out there with that banner out there in the front. Follow.
That is the sense of mission and vision.
What about the leadership challenges facing the global community today, particularly given what's going on in the world? And you have certainly been involved in a whole array of different issues at different times, and you continue to be involved on the international stage. What are we, it's like the question, I don't even know what the question is, but what are we looking for today in the realm of leadership? What are the issues and challenges? I think our students are as bewildered as much as those of us who are trying to teach them sometimes, but these challenges are huge.
Politics at its worst divides people. Politically astute thinking that through economic integration brings people together, unites them. So the US needs to invest in China and its people and have their people there. China needs to be encouraged to invest internationally, because when you're stakeholders, you don't blow each other to bits.
Right.
And it seems to me that that conversation, which globalization's forced on us,
Right.
folks, globalization's not a choice, it's a reality.
Yeah.
And the institutions that gave us such stability in the post-war era, IMF, UN, WTO, World Bank, did not assume that people could get on a plane and buy the numbers or the extent to which we can today, and they most certainly didn't foresee the internet simply making this world a borderless place. What interests me now is how can leaders, either through informal mechanisms or through reshaping and reforming our institutions, equip ourselves properly to deal with what is now the reality. Right. And I'm very anxious, to be frank, about the fact that our ponderous institutional framework is completely and utterly a mismatch now for this very dynamic and fluid new world, where it's going along at a gazillion miles an hour, and the choice of hopping off isn't a choice. So the solution of how do we get on this game and how do we encourage people? And I would say to people, whether they're from China or the US or anywhere, be outward looking and engaging. Because in that sort of an united sense of trying to understand and absorb the sense of culture and also the aspirations of people, then that economic union of purpose, where real markets exist and people participate in them, far more likely, in my opinion, to avoid any calamity than people retrenching. And the final element of this that really is absorbing me presently is that if we keep leaving, for whatever reason, populations within economies or across regions excluded from world economic participation, we leave an opportunity for the zealots to create an army of discontent. Right. And so things like free trade, with all the demands that it imposes on economies, I vehemently am opposed to the patronizing approach of aid, not trade, as being a solution. I am totally committed to trying to focus on how do you include people and make them economic stakeholders. So real markets emerge and real participation and inclusion is a reality. And in my experience, when people, whether they're Maori people in New Zealand, when they've switched from being dependent to independent, or excluded to included, or are suddenly stakeholders and shareholders in the future, they simply are transformed. And in doing so, the cohesion within economies is also an experience of transformation. And that sort of thing drives me now, and I've no idea where it will lead me, but there are commercial threads here. I'm having fun putting people together because of the relationships I formed. I speak professionally enough to make enough to then do a lot of stuff that I don't necessarily get paid for, but I feel committed to trying to push people's boundaries and say, come on, this isn't as scary as you think.
Pushing people's boundaries.